Oh, I remember taking music theory. I remember taking music theory quite vividly. Well, not always vividly, because sometimes I'd be too bored or concerned with material that was related but far more interesting to me. But not all of it was boring or uninteresting. I remember learning that notes were represented both by the letters A through G and their position on the staff, that sharps or flats are used to increment or decrement the pitch, respectively, of any note they were attached to by a half step, that a whole step was 2 half steps. Yeah. That scales were just collections of these notes, and that key signatures were just a way of explicitly stating how each note is modulated at the beginning of the piece, so you aren't forced to write something that looks as if you simultaneously had a grave issue with your keyboard. But ultimately, the key signature really is just a way of conveying which scale you're using. Then came the rules. Strange rules. I was told you could never mix sharps and flats in a key signature, and I seldom could be swayed from wondering why. But the lessons would not halt long enough for me to figure out why, and if I had taken the opportunity to focus on it, I would be left completely unaware of anything having taken place in the lesson. From there we moved on and learned about the major scale and the minor scale. There we were introduced to the C major scale, which seems cool and important for 2 reasons. For one, because all of the notes in the scale have no accidentals, or sharps and flats, meaning that they're just the letters A through G, but starting at C. And for 2, it's like, totally all the white spaces on the keyboard, so yeah. But I mean, all that isn't very telling of music in any sort of way. It's just a clever way of using the cataloging method, but I appreciated it immensely anyway. So, the C major scale looks and sounds like this when played on the piano. And quite smoothly, by counting the number of keys passed when traveling from one white key to the next, we may define the pattern of the major scale generally without referring to a key like this. Where position in the scale is referred to as the scale degree, and each scale degree is denoted by some positive integer. But since this is true, the original pattern can be reinterpreted as... But here we see that half isn't doing anything other than telling you that it is the unit, and it would be less confusing if we removed it because it would yield this. Which is the result we would have gotten by counting. But somewhere along the line we just decided to trade out all of the 2s for wholes and 1s for halves. But why? They were well represented as unitary distances by numbers to begin with. But also, it was clear that we weren't only going to ask the question, how far is this particular note denoted by its scale degree from the note denoted by the next scale degree, measured in half steps? I thought to myself, there should be some way to determine the number of half steps one needs to travel to get to the nth scale degree from the tonic, or the starting note of the scale. The pattern for this becomes... But there was no more time for thought and development of rational comprehension, for the lesson was hastily progressing toward modes. Continuing on, we learned that modes are types of scales, but with different step patterns than the major and minor scale we had just covered. We started with the first and most familiar mode, Ionian. I say it's the most familiar, however, because it is the major scale. Yeah. The next, Dorian, is a minor scale with its 6th scale degree raised a half step. After that comes Phrygian, which is a minor scale whose second scale degree is less by a half step. And it was at this point that I completely halted. It was clear that we were being expected to memorize the material being presented. I stopped and realized that continuing to listen to this lecture bot construct a menagerie of premises for me to record arbitrarily was not going to get me to understand music theory. And from that moment on, I listened far less and started developing an understanding. I was in trigonometry at the same time, going over phase shifts of trigonometric functions. And while I was bored in trig, I started thinking about music theory in the context of math. We had covered that every major scale is a relative minor scale that contains the same notes, but starts at a different one, and vice versa. Basically, that a major scale can be heard as a minor scale if someone walks into the room just as the sixth scale degree has been sounded. But this was exactly what a phase shift was. So if the minor scale was just a phase shift of the major scale by 5 scale degrees, then what were the other phase shifts? So I constructed them. And denoted the first as Ionian and the sixth as Aeolian. But looking at the construction a bit more closely, I realized that I had demonstrated that there were only 7 unique combinations that could come of shifting the scale. Could it be that this is what joined the modes together? Just a simple shift? Then why couldn't we refer to the modes by the size of the shift, which would be measured by integers from 1 through 7, rather than ancient Greek? But we continued on through the course without even the subtlest of acknowledgments that this was a problem. But as soon as we learned about the melodic and harmonic minor scales, which are not modes of the diatonic scales, we can easily see that a key signature that has only flats or only sharps cannot produce these scales. It was from this point on that I realized that, though brilliant, music theory, like most other subjects, is taught badly.